Hi everyone, in this section we're going to look at exception handling in Spring Security. So in our previous session what we saw is when we're trying to access a resource through browser, we get a white label error page, right? So in this scenario what happens is a Spring by default looks for the error path, and if not found, what it does is it shows you an error page with all the information. But in our case, what we want to do is we want to handle this scenario and return back a JSON object. Now in a web service, like if you're working on a RESTful web service, you might not need to look at white label error page, because this is something that you won't be accessing through the browser, right? You'll be either accessing through Postman or the client, if it is a whatever the application is, if it is an Angular app or any other app, they will be consuming your response in JSON format, right? So everything that is consumed and produced is in JSON format. So but it's always recommended that we handle this scenario where we don't want the default behavior of anything that comes with especially with the error response when you're using a Spring module, right? So let's handle the scenario, and we can do this in two ways. One is by disabling the white label error page in the application.properties file, and the other way is you can tell the Spring that, okay, I have implemented the path that is error path, and in that request mapping, that is that path, what we do is we will give the explicit request object, or we can say that we can handle that situation in that particular request mapping. So what I'll do is I'm going to use the second path, that is handling, giving a request mapping for /error. So let's go to our workspace here, and let's create a class called API error controller. And in this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have, okay, let me stop the server, and here I'm going to say controller, and this class is going to implement error controller. Okay, and I'll override get error path, and the error path is going to be this. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the mapping for the /error. And I'm going to just throw the exception. So now what I'm doing here is I'm going to tell the Spring that, okay, I have a mapping for the error, and when in this method I'm going to throw the exception, which is going to be handled by my API exception handler, where I have the logic to return back the JSON format of the API response. Okay, so that's what we're going to do here. Response, and the status I'm going to get it from the response. So let's take that HTTP servlet request response. Okay, and here I'm going to say this as value of and response dot get status. Perfect. So let's save this and let's start the server. The server is up, so let's go back to our browser and do a refresh, and now you can see that we get the error response in JSON format. Okay, so this looks good. We have handled one scenario where instead of seeing a white label error page, now we get the response in the browser. Now the next is the access denied exception. Okay, so when the user is trying to access the application resource, and if there is no JWT token in the request, we need to send back an error response. Okay, we need to tell that, okay, instead of we giving an exception, a random 403 exception, anyways, it's going to generate a 401 exception. So you have to remember one thing here is, whenever there is an access denied, the status is going to be 401. Okay, and there is another exception, that is authorization, that is unauthorized user. That is, if the user is authenticated but does not have enough privileges to access the application resource. So in that case, we have a status of 403, which is unauthorized. Okay, so we have to handle both the scenarios. So what we're going to do is, we are going to start with access denied exception. So for that, let's create a class in our exception package, and this I'm going to call it as JWT access denied handler. Okay, and this is going to implement, let me stop the server. Implements access denied. Okay, and this is going to override handle method. And in here, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to first set the status. It is going to be HTTP status dot, and I would say this as unauthorized. Okay, even though it is, if you look at the exception status code here, it is, let's see, unauthorized, that is 401. Even though it says unauthorized, is basically we follow a standard where 401 is access denied. Okay, for permission issues, you can see that there is another status that says forbidden. If you look at this, it is 403. Okay, this is something that we return back in case of the user is unauthorized. Okay, does not have enough permissions. So in our case, access denied case, we are going to use the unauthorized one. Okay, and the next, what I'm going to do is, okay, here it should be the value. The next is going to be response.set content type. I'm going to send it as media type dot application JSON value. Okay, next what I'm going to do is, I'm going to create the API error response. And then I would say this as unauthorized access denied. Okay, and let's now create the API error response. API error response builder dot get instance dot with error ID, and the error ID is going to be airline. I'm going to get the thread context, that is the request ID, and for path it's going to be yes get request URI. with errors, and then we are going to have it with message, and I will set this as unauthorized access. Then finally we're going to get the status, and the status is going to be again the same thing here. Let's copy this, and finally build. Okay, with this, let's put this into the response. Get output stream, and then I'm going to write my object to the response. So I'm going to use the mapper. Okay. And I'm going to say that I'm going to write the value, that is API error. Finally, I'm going to flush the response. Perfect. So with this, now we have a logic to handle the access denied exception. And let's annotate this with component. Okay, so this is done. So next, what we are going to do is we are going to write an exception class for unauthorized scenarios. Okay, so let's do that, and I'm going to create another class called JWT authentication entry point. Okay, though the name sound confusing, but it's basically what the class implements that matters. Okay, so here I'm going to create authentication entry point. Okay, and this is going to extend HTTP 403 entry point. Okay, and I'll annotate this with component, and I will override the comments method, and here I'm going to have the response dot set status. Now in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to forward the forbidden exception to the error page. Okay, the one that we created here, the API. Okay, this path we are going to forward it to this controller. Okay, that is API error controller. Instead of we doing what we have done here, right, putting everything in the response. Okay, what we are going to do is we are going to have it little different, that is by mapping it to the API error controller. So for that, we could have done the same thing for even access denied. Okay, where we could have forwarded the response to the API error controller, but I'm just showing you that different ways where you can have your own logic to exception handling. So here I'm going to do exception status dot forbidden dot value, and then request dispatcher. I'm going to dispatch it to the error. Okay, with this, now I'm going to do forward request response. So this is going to throw an exception, so we will handle it by this thing. Perfect. So I guess now we are good with the exception handling for 403 forbidden user. Okay, so with these two exception classes, we need to configure them in the app security config file. So for that, let's go back to our API security config, and let's create the instance and add it to the configure method. Here what I'm going to do is I'm going to create private JWT access denied handler, private JWT authentication entry point, okay, let's annotate this with Auto-wired. Perfect. And now what we are going to do is we are going to put that in our configure method here. So in the exception handling, I'm going to say access denied handler, and I'm going to say this dot exception handler, and then I'm also going to have the authentication entry point. Okay, and with that, perfect. So now what will happen is we have, whenever there is an exception, there is exception with 401, we have configured that with our access denied handler. And if there is an exception for the 403, that is unauthorized access, that is going to be handled by our JWT authentication entry point. Okay, so with that, I guess we are all good with the exception handling. One more scenario that we will handle is if there is a 403 exception, that is if the resource is not found. Let's try to access that. Okay, and let's go to our postman. Okay, first thing is let's start the server. The server is up. Let's go to the browser. Okay, so this looks good. Let's go to the postman, and here what I'm going to do is let's go to the let's go here, get flight. And what I'm going to do is, instead of having 40, like for now it's going to be something like, let's use some resource which is not available in the application. Okay, let's try to access it. So what we're getting is we are getting error ID. Okay, this is fine, error ID and this, and that is because, let's go back to our exception handler here. Where is this? Yes, okay, exception handler. If you go scroll down, okay, so let's add one method for the exception handler. Okay, in case of there is something that is not found, we get here error ID. But again, if you see there is something that says path, that's also good. But I would say that let's add one more method here that would handle the NoHandler exception. Okay, so if you look at here, there is a method called NoHandler exception. Let's see where it is. Handler, yes, this one, handle NoHandler found exception. So here is where we are going to add one more method for the exception handling for if there is no resource available. Okay, so here what I'm going to do is, first I'm going to get the request object from the request. At first I'll have to map it, and I would say this as servlet web request, and then get the request. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create the list of errors, and I would say this as exception.get message, and here it's going to be the request. I'll name this as request. Okay, is creating the API error response. So let me copy this from here. Okay. And try to edit this thing, and it's going to be the exception status is going to be from the status itself, that is here. Okay, and everything else looks good, and here also I'm going to send the status itself. Perfect. And what else? Okay, this is something that I would say object. Perfect, because we are having this object here has a return type, so I'm going to return the same thing. Okay, so this looks good. And if we go back to our Postman, get it's up. Let's try to access something called, let's say, get all flights, and let's try to send this, and you can see now we are getting the error ID. Okay, and the message is forbidden 403. So in previous case, what you would, if you don't have that handler and if you're trying to access something that okay, in this case it is basically, you know, it says 403 because of we don't have the authentication done. So let's do that. Let's see the header. I think we already need to, first we need to get, you know, first let's log in. Okay, and copy this and put it in here and try to send. Now you can see that it's a 404, right? So if you don't have this thing, that is this method overridden, what it's going to do is it's going to give you the response, again the JSON response, but it would be, you know, you won't be having the API error response with the error ID. So that is something that we achieved by overriding that and having our own implementation. So if the client is trying to access a resource which is not available, that is definitely going to be a 404 error. But now we have handled that scenario by implementing this method here. Okay, that is handle no handler found exception. Okay, so with this we have covered all the scenarios of exception handling in Spring Security. So I hope this was clear, and that's all for this video, and I'll see you in the next session. Till then, take care. Thank you.